everyone. In this video, we're going to describe skeletal muscle contraction. And to get us started, we're actually going to review a little bit of the basic anatomy and do a little overview. But what we're not going to do is describe the cellular structures in detail or describe the mechanics of muscle contraction in detail. So if there's any need to review those, I recommend reviewing the cardiac muscle contraction video because we're going to just highlight a couple of differences, but besides the differences we mentioned, they're basically the same. So in terms of the skeletal muscle cell, first of all, a muscle cell and a muscle fiber are those terms are interchangeable. It's the same thing. The muscle cell contains myofibrils, which contain sarcomeres, which is where we get to our actin and myosin. And in terms of the structure of skeletal muscle, so skeletal muscle is long, but not branched the way that cardiac muscle is, and not connected by intercalated discs the way that cardiac muscle is. So some differences there. And each muscle cell is surrounded by an endomysium, and the endomysium is different from the sarcolemma. So we still have the sarcolemma, which is the actual cell membrane. The endomysium is a layer of connective tissue. It actually contains a capillary network and neurons and some cells that are responsible for repair of the muscle fiber as needed. So if we were to take multiple muscle fibers and bundle them together, we can actually call that a fascicle. And the fascicle is surrounded by the perimysium, which contains some blood vessels and nerves as well. And then lastly, we'll take a bunch of fascicles and bundle them together, and that will actually be the muscle. And the muscle is surrounded by the epimysium, so one final layer of connective tissue. And I just want to mention that muscle is attached to bone, and so in order for this to occur, there has to be some space in the muscle itself where there isn't the actual muscle cells. And so what happens is at the ends of the muscle, we have all three layers of the connective tissue sort of merged together. They form a tendon. So the tendon is a fusion of the endomysium, the perimysium, and the epimysium, and that's what actually attaches to the bone. All right, so next I want to consider how skeletal muscle contraction is controlled. So we know that skeletal muscle is voluntary, so that means that it's under control of the somatic motor neurons. And so we know that the lower motor neuron extends off of the spinal cord. The upper motor neuron extends from the brain through the spinal cord, and then synapses on the lower motor neuron, which will actually synapse at the muscle fiber. And the specific place where the synapse occurs is at the motor end plate. So on a muscle fiber, we have the entire outside is the sarcolemma, but a specific segment of it is the motor end plate. And that is an area that contains nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So acetylcholine is released from the lower motor neuron at the synapse, and it will interact with the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, which we know are ionotropic, and they actually are connected to sodium channels. So the sodium channel will open in response to binding of ACH. So in terms of the events that occur in the lower motor neuron in order to stimulate muscle contraction, we start with an action potential that arrives at the synaptic knob. And once that action potential arrives, we mentioned that acetylcholine is going to be released and bind to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, which leads to sodium entry into the cell and subsequent depolarization. Now, it's at this point where the muscle fiber takes over and kind of does the rest of the work. So once depolarization occurs at the motor end plate, the depolarization will actually spread through the entire sarcolemma and also to the T-tubules. And the T-tubules, we know, contain calcium, and they also have, in their membrane, they have the dihydropyridine receptor. And so here's another important difference between cardiac muscle contraction and skeletal muscle contraction. In cardiac muscle contraction, we utilize calcium-induced calcium release. We have to have calcium entry through the T tubule at the dihydropyridine receptor in order to have calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. However, in the case of the skeletal muscle fiber, depolarization at the T tubule leads to a conformational change of the dihydropyridine receptor, which in turn leads to ryanodine receptor opening and calcium release into the myoplasm from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So basically, this means that we don't really need any extracellular calcium in order to have calcium availability for contraction. All we really need is depolarization at the T tubule, and then this series of events will still lead to calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So most of the calcium comes from the SR in the case of skeletal muscle. Now, this is just a quick recap because this we know already, and if not, it's just review it in the other video. So calcium binds to troponin. Tropomyosin moves off of the myosin binding site on actin. We have interaction of the actin and myosin for cross-bridge formation. Then we have the power stroke, which expends the remaining energy. And finally, a new ATP will arrive to the cross-bridge to allow cross-bridge separation and relaxation of the muscle fiber. Now, we know that in terms of relaxation, there's two things that have to happen. One is that there has to be ATP in order for the relaxation to occur, because that allows the cross-bridge separation. And we also have to have calcium reuptake back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, because as long as calcium remains available, muscle contraction will want to occur. Now, there's a couple things I want to mention just about the motor neuron and about this series of events. So acetylcholine, we mentioned, binds to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. And I just want to mention that acetylcholine is broken down by acetylcholinesterase, which is ACHE, an enzyme. And so after acetylcholine binding, for a couple of moments, the acetylcholinesterase will actually start to break down the ACH, which is why a repeat stimulation of the muscle will be needed for another depolarization to occur. So let's just take a look at, this is a graph of tension versus time, and this is really, we're just going to draw like a single twitch. So when we have a stimulus for muscle contraction, such as the action potential causes depolarization at the motor end plate, we will have a series of three events that will occur. The first is the latent period, and this is where the action potential sweeps across the sarcolemma and the calcium ions are released by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, but no tension is produced at this time. And then during the contraction phase, the cross bridges form and we get muscle tension that rises to a peak. So it's very important to remember when we're thinking about muscle contraction that muscle contraction is utilized to do work for the body. And, when we thought of cardiac muscle contraction, we really didn't focus on that too much, but we knew that the heart wanted to squeeze in order to pump the blood. And so it's very important to remember that even in skeletal muscle, we're shortening the muscle in order to sort of leverage that to do some work for the body. So the contraction phase is where we have the most amount of tension. And then we get to our peak, and then we begin relaxation phase. And during relaxation phase, the muscle tension falls back to resting levels. And this is where we have reuptake of calcium, and the cross bridges are separating because of the availability of ATP. So a muscle twitch is a single stimulus that includes the latent period contraction and relaxation. And we can actually consider a single twitch versus how we can have a more sort of sustained or more powerful muscle contraction. So in order to do so, we need to consider the idea of a motor unit. So a motor unit basically is a single motor neuron that communicates with a certain number of muscle fibers. And so it's not a one-to-one relationship. Instead, it's more of one motor neuron can synapse on, let's say, 2 or 3 muscle fibers. And if it's this small of a number, if it's such a tiny ratio, then what we're actually having is very fine motor control. So the fewer muscle fibers that are connected to one motor neuron, the better the motor control will be. And then when we have upwards of thousands of muscle fibers connected to one motor neuron, we know that this is more in the area of gross motor control. So we get a reduced ability for precision and fine motor control, but that expense is really in exchange for more power. So with that in mind, let's consider how we can develop a more powerful contraction. So as we mentioned, a twitch is just a single stimulus. And if we want more, we're going to utilize this idea of summation. And this should be familiar because we described summation with action potential formation in neurons. And so it's a little bit of the same idea. There are two types of summation, spatial and temporal. So spatial summation is recruitment of more motor units. So if we think about just, one or two motor units that are functioning, depending on how many muscle fibers that is, we can get a certain amount of muscle tone. But if we wanted to have more strength, more power, then we can actually just utilize more motor units, so more motor neurons that communicate with more muscle fibers. And if we think of temporal summation, that's more of time. So this is basically repeated stimulation before relaxation occurs. So we have initiation of a contraction, and then before relaxation is complete, we have another contraction, and then another contraction, and then another contraction, and so before we know it, we've actually able to develop a more powerful muscle contraction overall. And then we can consider tetany, which is basically when the rate of stimulation increases to completely eliminate relaxation. So the muscle stimulation is so fast that we don't have time for a contraction followed by a relaxation and then a new stimulus, but rather we have contraction, 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 and no relaxation. So we mentioned the idea of muscle tone, and this is important because not all motor units are always active. Some are always active, but these that are active when there's no real need for movement, their objective is not really to produce movement, but just to sort of firm the muscles. And so this brings us to another important point, which is to sort of consider what the functions of the skeletal muscles are. So we know that skeletal muscle is needed to produce movement by utilizing contractions to pull on the bones and actually allow for movement of the body. But when we think about this resting muscle tone, we can think more about the idea of something like maintaining posture and body position. So the ability to sit upright involves the contraction of some of the muscle fibers in the abdominal muscle group. So in this case, there's no expectation of movement, but there is the expectation of maintaining an upright posture. Similarly, we can also consider utilizing the skeletal muscles in their resting tone to support the weight of various visceral organs and guard entrances and exits via voluntary sphincters. So these functions are critically important and are constantly being performed. Just to sort of round out the discussion, also we utilize the skeletal muscle to maintain body temperature by utilizing voluntary skeletal muscle contraction for shivering. And also we can store nutrients in the skeletal muscle as well, which we can later use for energy. It's important to note that any muscle that's not stimulated will actually shrink and start to die over time, and this is called atrophy. Atrophy can be noticed in disease states, but it can also be noticed in people who stop exercising or stop going to the gym. After a period of time, you notice that the muscles that you've built have started to shrink back down to maybe their more original size. Okay, and lastly, let's just mention the energy supply in order for skeletal muscle contraction to occur. So it would be fair to say that skeletal muscle contains many mitochondria, but because the muscles have to be active sort of on short notice at times, or in some cases are constantly active, we want to be able to consider how the muscle is continuously supplied with energy. So there is a very small amount of ATP that is readily available. And this amount of ATP is really about seconds worth. It's a very tiny amount. So our second option is the use of something called creatine phosphate. So creatine phosphate is sort of similar to ATP in the sense that its job is to store phosphate and be able to transfer the phosphate on really very short notice. I just want to sort of describe the equation. So if we start with an ADP molecule and then we have our creatine phosphate, by utilization of this enzyme called creatine phosphokinase, or CPK for short, we can actually catalyze the conversion of ADP and creatine phosphate to become ATP and creatine. So we're essentially transferring that phosphate using an enzyme to make another ATP molecule. So what's kind of interesting about the CPK is while most of it is located in the myoplasm, there's a small amount that's located in the thick filament that actually can catalyze the resynthesis of ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate, it doesn't really offer a lot of support because the amount of creatine phosphate is only about 5 times the amount of ATP and still is only good for a matter of seconds. So once we've exhausted the use of creatine phosphate, we next move on to describe anaerobic metabolism. So anaerobic metabolism will occur in the absence of oxygen. So it's good for a rapid burst of power, but it's not good for a long-term exercise. And we know that in terms of the synthesis of ATP in this situation, it's substrate level phosphorylation, which is extremely energy inefficient. We know that we utilize some ATP to make ATP, and the gain is actually very small, but it does offer us a small amount as a resource. And then finally, we have aerobic metabolism, which obviously requires oxygen, and this is actually really slow to develop. It takes kind of a little bit longer to get this sort of started in terms of making the rest of the ATP that's needed for remaining activity. But we know that because it's oxidative phosphorylation, it offers a much larger amount of ATP in terms of its output. Now, also just want to mention that in terms of oxygen utilization in the skeletal muscle actually contains myoglobin. So it's similar to hemoglobin in the sense that it binds oxygen, but it's different in the sense that it's only a single subunit as opposed to 4 subunits. And so the curve for myoglobin looks completely different. It's just sort of like a more traditional saturation curve in the sense that once you have filled up all of the myoglobin with oxygen, the myoglobin is full, and that's kind of all that happens. And so I just want to mention that the myoglobin is present and is utilized to store oxygen because that oxygen will then be utilized to make the ATP. So it's just sort of being transferred. And if there is, for some reason, death of the skeletal muscles or rupture of the muscles, we actually get release of myoglobin into the plasma, into circulation. And so there's actually a disease process called rhabdomyolysis, where this is what's happening. We have muscle cell breakdown, and the muscle cells actually rupture and release a variety of things, but most concerningly, they release myoglobin, which actually can clog up the renal tubule, and so it can cause renal failure. And the other thing that's commonly released is potassium. So we know that potassium is most highly concentrated inside of the cells, and if something happens where we're losing our potassium and it's increasing in the interstitial space in the plasma, we can have a variety of challenging and possibly lethal complications. The last thing I want to mention before we wrap up is this idea of oxygen debt. And so basically when the body is really struggling, so even in periods of intense exercise, we could just use as an example, when the body is struggling to meet the energy demands, so we're not getting enough oxygen delivery to the peripheral tissues, the skeletal muscles will continue to work, but you're sort of incurring this oxygen debt during that period of time. And so what happens is, as soon as rest is available, so you stop running and now you're just panting, the respiratory rate remains elevated for a period of time until the oxygen debt can be repaid. And so once enough oxygen is now inhaled in order to travel to all the skeletal muscles that are deficient, the respiratory rate can return to normal. So that actually concludes our description of skeletal muscle contraction. Some things that we want to be able to consider are how various drugs affect skeletal muscle activity, as well as how various disease processes affect that involve the skeletal muscles can affect the body. But in terms of basic content, this actually is the beginning and the conclusion. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.